The conflict between Israel and Palestine is one of the most complex and deeply rooted disputes in human history. Depending on perspective, people view it in different ways. For many Christians, it is more than just a territorial struggle. It is a spiritual battle that has been unfolding for thousands of years, tied to ancient prophecies and divine promises. They see Israel's existence and the ongoing conflict as part of a larger biblical narrative, one that involves God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. Some believe that the restoration of Israel in 1948 was a fulfillment of prophecy, and that the ongoing tensions surrounding Jerusalem and the land itself are signs of a greater spiritual war at play. On the other hand, political analysts and historians tend to see the conflict through a more practical lens, as a nationalist and territorial struggle between two peoples who both lay claim to the same land. The modern dispute, in their view, dates back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Jewish immigrants began arriving in Palestine as part of the Zionist movement, aiming to establish a Jewish homeland. As Jewish immigration increased, tensions rose between Jewish and Arab communities in the region, fueled by competing national identities, land disputes, and British colonial policies. The situation escalated after World War I, when the United Nations proposed the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. While Jewish leaders accepted the plan, Arab leaders rejected it, seeing it as an unjust division of their land. When Israel declared independence in 1948, neighboring Arab nations invaded, and the First Arab-Israeli War began, leading to mass displacement of Palestinians and deepening the sense of injustice on both sides. Regardless of whether one sees the conflict as a spiritual war or a geopolitical struggle, it remains one of the most enduring disputes in modern history. It is a conflict that goes beyond mere politics, touching on identity, faith, and historical grievances. For Jews, the land of Israel is not just a place of residence, but a fulfillment of a divine promise, a homeland that was taken from them and then miraculously restored. For Palestinians, the land represents their ancestral home, one they feel was unjustly taken, leaving them in a state of displacement and statelessness. This fundamental clash of historical narratives makes resolution extremely difficult, as both sides see their claim as not just legitimate, but existential. The historical roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict trace back thousands of years, deeply embedded in religious narratives, ancient history, and national identities. According to the Bible, the origins of the dispute begin with Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham, regarded as the patriarch of both Jews and Arabs, was promised by God that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. However, the division arises in how this promise was fulfilled. The Bible states that God's covenant would be passed through Isaac, whose son Jacob became the father of the Israelites. This belief forms the foundation of the Jewish claim to the land, as they see themselves as the chosen heirs of this divine promise. At the same time, Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, an Egyptian servant, was also blessed by God. In Genesis, it is prophesied that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation, and his descendants are traditionally understood to include the Arab people, among them, the Palestinians. This ancestral connection has led many Palestinians to see themselves as rightful inheritors of the land as well. Some also trace their lineage back to the ancient Canaanites, arguing that their connection to the land predates both Judaism and Islam. This fundamental division in origin stories has contributed to the ongoing struggle over territory. For Jews, Israel is not just a homeland, but a fulfillment of God's eternal covenant, reaffirmed throughout the Old Testament in his promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and later to Moses and King David. The land is seen as sacred and inextricably tied to their faith and identity. For Palestinians, however, the land represents their ancestral home, where they and their ancestors have lived for centuries. Their claim is not just historical, but deeply personal, rooted in generations of cultural and familial ties to the land. Because of this, the conflict is not just political, but emotional, spiritual, and deeply tied to identity. Both sides believe they have a legitimate and historical right to the land, making compromise difficult. The dispute is not only about borders or governance, but also about belonging, justice, and historical recognition. This clash of narratives, one based on religious covenant and the other on ancestral heritage, has made the Israel-Palestine conflict one of the most intractable struggles in modern history. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was a turning point in the Israel-Palestine conflict, marking both a historic triumph for the Jewish people and a devastating catastrophe for the Palestinians. For Jews, it was the fulfillment of a long-held dream, a return to their ancestral homeland after centuries of exile and persecution. For Palestinians, however, it represented the loss of their land, identity, and future, leading to mass displacement and ongoing struggles for sovereignty. The roots of this moment trace back to the late 19th century with the rise of Zionism, a movement advocating for a Jewish homeland in response to centuries of discrimination, pogroms, and ultimately the horrors of the Holocaust. Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, pushed for a Jewish state, and by the early 1900s, Jewish immigration to Palestine steadily increased, especially as anti-Semitism worsened in Europe. At the time, Palestine was under Ottoman rule, and its population was predominantly Arab, with a smaller Jewish minority. When the British took control of Palestine after World War I, they issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, expressing support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. However, this conflicted with earlier British promises to Arab leaders regarding independence, creating deep resentment among the local Arab population. Tensions between Jews and Arabs escalated in the 1922 and 1932 as Jewish immigration and land purchases increased, leading to violent clashes and rising nationalist sentiments on both sides. By the 1942, with the devastation of the Holocaust and thousands of Jewish refugees seeking safety, international pressure mounted for the establishment of a Jewish state. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan that divided Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. Jews, though unhappy with the division, accepted the plan, while Arabs rejected it, seeing it as an unjust colonial imposition that favored the Jewish minority. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate ended, David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence. The very next day, 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, invaded, aiming to destroy the new state. This 1948 Arab-Israeli war resulted in a decisive Israeli victory, but had devastating consequences for Palestinians. Over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, many fleeing in fear or being forcibly removed from their homes in what they call the Nakba catastrophe. This mass displacement created a permanent refugee crisis, and the memory of 1948 remains at the heart of Palestinian identity and demands for justice. Meanwhile, for Israelis, the war symbolized their survival against all odds and the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream of statehood. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War not only established the State of Israel, but also set the stage for decades of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. One of the most significant consequences of this war was the mass displacement of Palestinians, an event known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, which remains central to Palestinian identity and grievances today. Over 700,000 Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes, leading to a refugee crisis that still persists. Entire Palestinian villages were either depopulated or destroyed, and those who fled found themselves in refugee camps in neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as well as in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The causes of this mass exodus are still hotly debated. Many Israeli historians argue that most Palestinians fled voluntarily, expecting neighboring Arab armies to quickly defeat Israel so they could return. However, Palestinian scholars emphasize forced expulsions carried out by Jewish militias, particularly under Plan Dalet, a military strategy aimed at securing the borders of the new Israeli state. Regardless of the causes, The result was the same. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lost their homes and became stateless, unable to return even after the war ended. By the time the 1,949 armistice agreements were signed, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine, far more than what was originally allocated under the UN partition plan. The remaining Palestinian territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, were taken by Jordan and Egypt, respectively. This division left Palestinians without a state, deepening their sense of displacement and injustice. For Palestinians, the Nakba is not just a historical event, it is an ongoing reality. The refugee crisis created in 1948 still affects millions of Palestinians today, with many living in overcrowded refugee camps under poor conditions, denied citizenship in host countries, and unable to return to their ancestral lands. The right of return, the demand that Palestinian refugees and their descendants be allowed to return to the homes they lost in 1948, remains one of the most contentious issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Every year on May 15, Palestinians commemorate Nakba Day, mourning the loss of their homeland and demanding recognition of their rights. Meanwhile, Israelis celebrate their Independence Day, marking their survival and the rebirth of their nation. This deep divide in historical memory continues to fuel tensions, shaping both national identities and making peace efforts extraordinarily difficult. The Six-Day War of 1967 was one of the most significant turning points in the modern Middle East, reshaping the geopolitical landscape and intensifying the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Israel, it was a remarkable military victory that solidified its position in the region. For Palestinians and the surrounding Arab states, however, it marked the beginning of a prolonged Israeli occupation, a reality that continues to fuel tensions today. The war did not happen overnight. Since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, there had been growing hostilities between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Arab nations, particularly under Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, remained committed to reversing Israel's creation and reclaiming lost Palestinian land. Skirmishes along Israel's borders, combined with Arab nationalist movements, Cold War rivalries, and unresolved territorial disputes, created a highly volatile situation. In May 1967, tensions escalated dramatically when Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, blocking Israel's access to the Red Sea, an act that Israel considered a declaration of war. With Arab armies mobilizing along its borders, Israel launched a preemptive strike on June 5, 1967, marking the start of the war. Within just 6 days, Israel achieved a stunning victory, decisively defeating Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. By the end of the war on June 10, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria. This victory tripled Israel's territory and brought over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli military rule. The most symbolic and controversial conquest was East Jerusalem, home to the Western Wall, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Dome of the Rock, sacred sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Israel declared Jerusalem its eternal and undivided capital, but Palestinians and the Arab world saw this as a major provocation. The war exacerbated the Palestinian refugee crisis, as thousands more were displaced. It also set the stage for decades of Israeli occupation, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, where Palestinians sought self-determination. The UN passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories in exchange for peace, but its vague wording left room for interpretation. Meanwhile, Israel began building settlements in the West Bank, further complicating the path to peace. The Six-Day War fundamentally changed the Israel-Palestine conflict, making it not just a territorial struggle, but an issue of occupation, resistance, and national identity, one that continues to shape the region today. The Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the most deeply entrenched disputes in modern history, driven by competing claims over land, identity, and historical justice. At the heart of the issue are several core disputes that have made peace nearly impossible. the status of Jerusalem, Israeli settlements, Palestinian refugees, and the broader struggle for sovereignty. One of the most sensitive and unresolved issues is Jerusalem. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim the city as their capital. After the 1948 war, Jerusalem was divided, with West Jerusalem controlled by Israel and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, controlled by Jordan. However, after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem, bringing the entire city under its control. Israel later annexed East Jerusalem, declaring it part of its eternal and undivided capital. This move, however, has never been recognized by the United Nations and most of the international community, which considers East Jerusalem occupied territory. Palestinians see East Jerusalem as the future capital of their independent state, making it one of the most contentious issues in peace negotiations. Another major point of contention is the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Since 1967, Israel has encouraged Jewish settlers to move into these areas, building communities on land that Palestinians claim for their future state. Today, there are over 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The international community, including the United Nations, largely considers these settlements illegal under international law, arguing that they violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. However, Israel disputes this interpretation, with many Israelis seeing the West Bank as part of their biblical and historical homeland. The expansion of settlements has further complicated the possibility of a two-state solution, as it has fragmented Palestinian territory, making the creation of a viable Palestinian state more difficult. The Palestinian refugee crisis is another unresolved issue. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced during the 1948 war, and today their descendants number in the millions, many living in refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Gaza, and the West Bank. Palestinians demand the right of return, arguing that those displaced and their descendants should be allowed to return to their ancestral homes. Israel, however, strongly opposes this, fearing that allowing millions of Palestinian refugees to return would endanger its Jewish majority and threaten the very existence of Israel as a Jewish state. Ultimately, the conflict is not just about borders or politics. It is, for many people, the Israel-Palestine conflict is more than just a political struggle. It is a battle deeply intertwined with religion, prophecy, and spiritual beliefs. Many Jews and Christians see the conflict through the lens of biblical prophecy, believing that the land of Israel was divinely promised to the Jewish people as part of God's covenant with Abraham. At the same time, many Muslims and Palestinians see the struggle as one of justice and resistance, fighting for their right to reclaim a land they have lived in for centuries. This clash of spiritual and historical narratives makes the conflict particularly difficult to resolve. From a biblical perspective, the roots of this struggle go back to God's promise to Abraham in the Book of Genesis. According to the Jewish and Christian traditions, God made an everlasting covenant with Abraham and his descendants, promising them the land of Canaan, which includes present-day Israel and Palestine. This covenant was later reaffirmed with Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and King David, leading many religious Jews and Christians to believe that modern-day Israel's existence is part of God's divine plan. Some see the restoration of Israel in 1948 and the recapture of Jerusalem in 1967 as fulfillments of biblical prophecy, signaling the approach of the end times. However, for Palestinians, many of whom identify as Muslims or Christians, the conflict is not just about religious prophecy. It is about land, displacement, and historical justice. Many Palestinians trace their ancestry back to the ancient Canaanites, Arabs, and other groups who lived in the region long before the creation of the modern state of Israel. They see themselves as the rightful inhabitants of the land, and many argue that their displacement in 1948 and 1967 was an act of colonization and ethnic cleansing, not a fulfillment of divine prophecy. The status of Jerusalem is particularly significant in this religious struggle. For Jews, Jerusalem is the holiest city, home to the Western Wall and the site of the ancient Jewish temples. For Muslims, Jerusalem is also sacred, as it is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. Because of this, many religious scholars believe that Jerusalem will remain a central point of global conflict, as described in biblical prophecy. For some Christians and Jews, the modern struggle over Israel is part of a spiritual battle between good and evil, leading up to the end times described in the Book of Revelation and the prophecies of Zechariah and Ezekiel. Some believe that Jerusalem will be the center of a final war, leading to the return of the Messiah. This religious dimension adds another layer of complexity to the conflict. While political solutions may address borders, governance, and security, the deeper spiritual and historical claims on both sides make compromise incredibly difficult. For many, this is not just about land. It is about faith, prophecy, and destiny. The Israel-Palestine conflict remains one of the most challenging and unresolved disputes in modern history, with no clear solution in sight. Over the decades, countless efforts have been made to establish peace, but fundamental disagreements over land, identity, and historical justice continue to fuel tensions. One of the most widely proposed solutions has been the two-state solution, which envisions an independent Palestinian state existing alongside Israel. However, negotiations have repeatedly failed due to disagreements over borders, security, Jerusalem, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. The status of Jerusalem remains one of the biggest obstacles to peace. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim the city as their capital, and international attempts to mediate a fair compromise have been largely unsuccessful. In 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem, later annexing it and declaring the entire city its eternal and undivided capital. However, the United Nations and most of the world continue to view East Jerusalem as occupied territory. Palestinians insist that East Jerusalem must be the capital of their future state, making it one of the most intractable issues in any peace negotiations. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank has further complicated efforts toward a two-state solution. Since 1967, Israel has built hundreds of settlements, which now house over 700,000 Israeli settlers. These settlements, widely considered illegal under international law, have made it increasingly difficult to establish a contiguous Palestinian state. For many Palestinians, these settlements represent an effort to erase their future homeland, while Israel sees them as a natural extension of their historical and biblical land rights. In the real world, we have seen conflicts that once seemed impossible to resolve eventually find pathways to peace. South Africa, for example, once suffered from a deeply entrenched system of apartheid, where racial segregation and oppression seemed irreversible. Yet through negotiation, activism, and international pressure, the system was dismantled, and the country transitioned to democracy without a full-scale civil war. Similarly, the Good Friday Agreement, 1998, ended decades of violent conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, showing that even the most bitter historical divisions can be overcome through compromise and perseverance. So, what lessons can we learn from these cases? First, peace requires genuine dialogue and compromise, where both sides acknowledge each other's historical suffering and legitimate aspirations. Second, international mediation can help, but lasting peace must be driven by local leaders and communities who are willing to move beyond past grievances. Third, justice must be addressed, as no peace can last when one side feels systematically oppressed or denied its basic rights. The Israel-Palestine conflict remains unresolved, and deep-rooted mistrust and violence continue to shape the daily lives of people in the region. However, history has shown that even the most impossible conflicts can eventually find a path forward if leaders and societies have the courage to pursue peace over war, reconciliation over revenge, and humanity over hatred.